At 2:17 a.m., the locomotive entered a stretch of track so empty that even the moon looked lonely above it. No towns. No stations. Just iron rails cutting through fields and trees like a promise. The engineer had made this run 100 times. Same curves, same small bridges, same whistle points. And that's what made it dangerous. Because on a night like that, the train wasn't just a machine. It was a moving vault. Somewhere ahead, in the darkness, a handful of men waited beside the rails. They weren't looking for passengers. They weren't looking for trouble. They were looking for the thing that traveled on trains before anyone could track it, freeze it, or cancel it. Money. Payroll. Bonds. Gold. Letters of credit. Whatever name it wore, it meant power in a small town, and it meant survival to people who had been living on the edge for years. And the plan was simple. Stop the train, take the strongbox, vanish before dawn. It would be remembered as the old train robbery of the state, told and retold in barber shops, in courthouse corridors, and in the kinds of stories where the truth gets sanded down and turned into legend. But the real story begins earlier, long before the tracks went quiet. In the age of steam, railroads stitched the state together. Farmers sent crops to distant markets. Merchants filled shelves with goods that used to take weeks to arrive. Families traveled farther than their grandparents ever imagined. But railroads also carried something else: concentration. Instead of money moving slowly, coin by coin through local hands, wealth began to move in bulk. Payroll for a mine. Cash for a factory. Receipts from a bank. Even election materials, legal documents, and private correspondence that could ruin reputations. The train didn't just carry the state's economy. It carried its secrets. And where secrets and money move, someone will always step out of the dark to meet them. That's what made a train robbery possible: routine, predictability, the confidence that tomorrow would look like yesterday. The route in this story crossed the state the way a river crosses land, always moving, always carrying. It passed small depots where lantern lights spilled onto platforms. It passed stretches of wilderness where you could stand on the tracks and listen for a train long before you saw it. The robbers studied that route with a kind of patience most people never practice. They didn't need to know every station. They needed one place. A place where the train slowed. A bend. A hill. A bridge. A water stop. A crossing where the engineer had no choice but to reduce speed. And someone was watching. Robbers in old stories are often painted as monsters or folk heroes. In reality, they were usually something simpler: men with debts, men with grudges, men with a plan that seemed easier than slow work. They were not all strangers to one another. They gathered in places where questions weren't asked: barns, back rooms, edge-of-town shacks. A few of them knew weapons. A few of them knew the land. One of them knew trains. And one of them had a reason that felt personal. Maybe a bank had taken a farm. Maybe a boss had cut pay. Maybe a partner had betrayed him. Or maybe he was just tired of being broke in a state that was getting richer without him. Motives shift depending on who tells the story. But in every version, there's one constant. They believed they could do it once, and never need to do it again. On the night of the robbery, the crew wasn't thinking about legend. They were thinking about pressure gauges, braking distance, and the next whistle point. An engineer who had a family waiting somewhere. A conductor who knew every regular passenger by face. A brakeman with hands toughened by cold metal. Maybe a mail clerk sorting envelopes under swaying lamplight. If the train carried a strongbox, it might also carry a guard, sometimes armed, sometimes not, sometimes more for appearance than protection. And the crew had one advantage and one weakness. The advantage was experience. The weakness was that experience creates trust, and trust can be exploited. The robbers chose their place carefully. They needed cover from the open sky. They needed a line of sight down the tracks. They needed a way to force the train to stop without turning the whole event into chaos. There are different ways train robberies were done. Sometimes it was a false signal, someone waving a lantern in a pattern that meant danger ahead. Sometimes it was a barricade on the tracks, logs, rocks, or a wagon. Sometimes it was sabotage, loosened rail fasteners, or a damaged switching mechanism. The old robbery in this state, according to most serious accounts, relied on the oldest trick of all. Make the engineer believe stopping is the safest choice. A single light in the dark can turn a powerful machine into a hesitant animal. When the engineer saw the signal, he reacted the way he'd been trained to react. He pulled back the throttle. He reached for the brake. The train slowed with a long, heavy obedience. And as it slowed, the robbers stepped closer to the rails. Their hearts were pounding, but their faces had to look calm, because the first seconds decide everything. If the crew panics, you lose control. If you lose control, you lose time. And time, on a train line, is the difference between a clean escape and a manhunt. The locomotive came to a stop. And the state's most famous story, whether true in every detail or not, moved from planning into action. A stopped train is a strange thing. It feels wrong, like a heartbeat pausing. The engine still breathes, steam leaking, metal ticking, but the forward motion is gone. And in that pause, everyone becomes aware of how far they are from safety. The robbers approach the engine first, because if you control the front, you control the narrative. In some versions of the story, the lead robber called the engineer by name. In others, he didn't have to, because fear makes strangers recognizable. Either way, the message was clear. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Most robberies aren't defined by bullets. They're defined by the moment someone decides whether they will resist. The crew had seconds to choose. Engineers had been shot in other robberies. Conductors had been beaten. Guards had died trying to be brave. But bravery on a lonely track doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like keeping your hands steady so no one gets killed. The robbers didn't need to harm anyone. Harm brings attention. Harm brings blood. Blood brings the kind of anger that keeps Posses riding past exhaustion. So they used the threat the way a lock uses a key, precisely. A weapon shown, not fired. A voice raised, not screaming. Enough pressure to open the door. Now comes the practical question: where was the strongbox? Trains carried valuables in different places. Sometimes in a baggage car. Sometimes in a mail car. Sometimes under guard in a locked compartment. Sometimes split between containers to reduce risk. The robbers in this story had done their homework. They moved past passengers, who froze in their seats, eyes wide, holding their breath, and they headed straight for the car that mattered. They weren't guessing. They were hunting. The lock resisted. Locks always do at first. And here the story divides into two kinds of truth: the dramatic truth and the likely truth. The dramatic truth is dynamite. Sparks. A thunderclap that wakes the countryside. The likely truth is quieter: tools, leverage, and intimidation. A force key. A pried hinge. A gun pointed at the right person until the right hand produces the right key. Either way, the door opened. And inside was the reason for the night. A strongbox is not a treasure chest. It's a burden. Dense metal. Awkward corners. Designed to be difficult to move quickly. Which is why robberies like this require planning. The robbers brought sacks, or a crate, or a way to carry weight without losing speed. They didn't want coins spilling onto the floor. They didn't want to fumble. They wanted to grab and go. And for a few minutes, maybe 5, maybe 10, the plan worked. The crew stayed alive. The passengers stayed quiet. The train sat helpless in the dark, and the robbers held the state's money in their hands. But robberies are never only about taking. They're about leaving. And leaving is where most plans fail. Even in the middle of nowhere, night has ears. A farmer might hear a whistle at the wrong time. A watchman might notice a delay. A station agent might start asking why the schedule doesn't match the clock. And once questions start, they spread like fire. The robbers knew they had a shrinking window. They moved away from the train, not toward town. They chose a route that used darkness like a road. In some tellings, the robbers rode horses waiting nearby. In others, they walked first, then rode later. In still others, they hid the money and went separate ways, returning after the search cooled. What matters is not the exact method. What matters is the logic: split attention, split risk. When the robbers disappeared into the dark, the train crew did what crews do after shock. They moved. They got the train rolling again, because motion is communication. Motion says, "We're alive." Motion says, "Something happened." The conductor's hands may have been shaking as he checked on passengers. The engineer may have felt anger boiling under fear. A guard, if there was one, may have stared at empty holsters and wished time could rewind. And then came the first official response. The nearest station, the nearest telegraph, the first message sent down the line. A robbery. A stopped train. Men with weapons. Unknown direction. That tapping sound, short, sharp, was the beginning of the manhunt. By sunrise, the story was already changing. Witnesses filled in gaps with emotion. Small details became big ones. Big details got simplified. Some said there were 3 robbers. Some said 6. Some swore they saw masks. Others said the men looked ordinary, like neighbors you might greet in daylight. And that's the unsettling part. The old train robbery didn't just scare people because it was violent. It scared people because it suggested the danger might be familiar. Local lawmen formed search parties. Railroad officials arrived with tight jaws and angry eyes. Townspeople gathered, hungry for news. Someone offered a reward. Someone else offered another. And now, for the first time, the robbers had a new problem. Their success had created attention. And attention is heavy. Heavier than any strongbox. Most crimes don't become legends. They become paperwork, reports, notes, faded ink in courthouse files. So why did this one last? Partly because trains were symbols. People trusted them. They were progress you could hear coming. A robbery on the rails felt like an attack on the future. And partly because the manhunt, whether it ended in arrests, or in whispers, or in a quiet settlement nobody wrote down, left the state with a wound it kept touching to see if it was still there. In the old days, a manhunt was not a clean operation. It was messy, human, and often wrong. Lawmen started with the obvious: who was desperate, who had a record, who had been seen drinking too much and talking too loud. They questioned stable hands. They questioned hotel clerks. They questioned shopkeepers who knew everyone's business. They watched for sudden spending, new clothes, new guns, paid off debts. Because stolen money doesn't just buy things. It changes behavior. Rumors can be useful. They can also destroy innocent people. And in the wake of a robbery, fear makes people eager to point. Railroad companies didn't like being embarrassed. A successful robbery was a public statement: you can be stopped. You can be taken from. So railroads responded the way institutions respond, with policy. More guards on money shipments. Better locks. Strict protocols for stopping at unscheduled signals. Possibly armored cars on certain routes. Coordination with local law enforcement. They also began to do something that sounds modern: risk management. Which routes were vulnerable? Which stations were too isolated? Which crews needed training? Because after the robbery, Every dark curve on the line looked like a threat. If the robbers got away that night, their next challenge wasn't escape. It was, after. How do you turn stolen wealth into a normal life without drawing a circle around yourself? Stolen bills can be traced by serial numbers, especially if banks are alert. Gold can be recognized. Bonds can be impossible to cash without questions. So criminals do what criminals have always done. They launder, they trade, they hide, they wait. And waiting is hard. Waiting means living with fear. Fear of a knock at the door. Fear of a stranger in town. Fear that your own friends will sell you out for a reward. In many old cases, robberies ended in one of three ways. 1. The robbers were caught quickly because somebody talked, or because they panicked and made a mistake. 2. They were caught slowly, years later, after a separate crime, after a drunken confession, after a small slip. Or 3. They were never officially caught at all, only known in the way small communities know things without writing them down. The old train robbery in this state has versions that fit every ending. Some stories insist there was a dramatic shootout. Others insist there were arrests and trials. Others, spoken more quietly, suggest the truth was negotiated, buried, or simply lost to time. What we can say, without romance and without exaggeration, is this. When a crime becomes legend, it usually means the ending wasn't satisfying. People keep retelling it because they want closure. The robbery didn't just affect the railroad's accounts. It affected people. Passengers who never forgot the sound of boots on a train car floor at night. Crew members who replayed the moment they stopped, wondering if they could have prevented it. Families who depended on the stolen payroll, if payroll was what was taken, waiting longer for wages. Small businesses that felt the delay. Towns that became suspicious of strangers. And the robbers themselves, if they lived long enough to become old men, carried their own cost. A crime like that is a shadow that follows you into daylight, even if you never get caught. Today, trains still run. Money still moves. Security is stronger. Communication is instant. But the core lesson of the old train robbery remains simple and modern. When a system depends on routine, routine becomes a vulnerability. The robbers didn't defeat the railroad with strength. They defeated it with knowledge of schedules, habits, and human reactions. And the railroad responded not by becoming fearless, but by becoming smarter. That's what history often is. A cycle of invention, exploitation, and improvement. If you stand near the tracks late at night, far from town, away from streetlights, you can still hear a train coming long before you see it. The ground carries the vibration. The air carries the promise of motion. And for a moment, it feels like the past is still alive inside that sound. A reminder that progress always travels with risk. And that somewhere, in the dark edges of old stories, a lantern might still be waving, trying to make a powerful machine stop.